The air was thick with tension as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of deep orange and crimson. Malcolm Hayes had always been aware of the eyes that followed him, the weight of unspoken judgments, the suspicion that clung to his presence like an unwanted shadow. But he had learned to live with it, to move through the world with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his worth, even if the world refused to see it. His German shepherd Rex trotted beside him, his movements fluid and confident, his presence both a comfort and a reminder. Rex had been more than a companion. He was family, a steadfast protector who had stood by Malcolm through deployments, through loss, through the countless battles that never made the headlines. Malcolm had spent years in the U.S. Army's Delta Force, training for the most dangerous missions in the world. He had taken down warlords, dismantled terrorist cells, and operated in the kind of places where one mistake meant never coming home. Yet, here in his own neighborhood, he found himself navigating a different kind of battlefield, one where he was seen not as a man who had given everything to protect his country, but as a threat. He had felt it in the glances from his neighbors, the way some would cross the street when they saw him coming. It wasn't new, but it was exhausting. Rex's ears perked up before Malcolm even heard the approaching car. The familiar shape of a police cruiser rolled to a stop a few yards away, and instinct told him that this was not just another routine patrol. The doors opened in unison, and two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters as if they were already anticipating trouble. "Evening, sir," the first officer, Calloway, said, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone who had already made up his mind. His partner, Miller, stood slightly behind him, his eyes scanning Malcolm with the calculating look of a man deciding just how much force he could get away with using. Malcolm kept his stance relaxed, though every muscle in his body was already coiled with the kind of readiness that had been ingrained in him through years of combat. "Evening, officers," he replied evenly. "You live around here?" Calloway asked, tilting his head slightly, as if Malcolm's very presence required an explanation. Malcolm didn't flinch. "I do." Calloway let out a short chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "That's so? Funny, don't think I've seen you before." "I travel for work," Malcolm said simply, keeping his voice level. He had learned long ago that men like these fed off reactions. Give them nothing, and they'd look for another excuse. Miller's gaze dropped to Rex. "That's a big dog," he noted, his tone shifting, calculating. "Trained?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "For what?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, already knowing where this was going. "Obedience, protection." Calloway's smirk widened. "Protection, huh? You expecting trouble?" "Not usually," Malcolm said, his patience thinning. "But it seems to find me." Miller let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "A dog like that can do some real damage if he's not under control." "He is under control," Malcolm said firmly. Calloway nodded, as if he had just reached a decision. "We're going to need to see some ID." Malcolm knew his rights. He could refuse. He could ask what probable cause they had. But he also knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. He reached into his jacket slowly, making sure every movement was measured. He felt the leash tighten just slightly in his grip, Rex sensing the shift in energy, his posture stiffening. Miller's fingers twitched near his belt. "Easy there?" Malcolm suppressed the urge to scoff. "I'm moving slow, aren't I?" He pulled out his wallet, holding it up for them to take. Calloway barely glanced at it before waving a dismissive hand. "Nah, I think we need you to step over here for a second. Just a few questions." Malcolm felt the familiar burn of frustration in his chest. He had been through this before. Cooperate, comply, don't escalate. But it never seemed to matter. He took a single step forward. That was when everything changed. Miller moved first, his hand shooting toward Malcolm's wrist, but before he could complete the motion, Rex shifted, his protective instincts kicking in. A single warning growl rumbled deep in his chest. He didn't lunge, didn't snap, didn't move. He just let them know. And it was enough. Miller's hand flew to his gun. The world slowed. Malcolm saw it happen before it did, saw the trajectory of the motion. The way the officer's body tensed, the subtle shift of weight that told him this wasn't hesitation. This was intention. The gunshot shattered the night. Rex let out a sharp yelp, his body jerking as the bullet tore into him. Malcolm didn't hear his own voice as he dropped to his knees, catching Rex before he hit the pavement. The world blurred around him, colors bleeding into one another, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He pressed his hands against the wound, his fingers slick with warmth, with life slipping away too fast. Calloway's voice cut through the fog, smug and indifferent. "Told you that dog was a liability." Malcolm lifted his head slowly, his vision burning, his pulse a thunderous roar in his ears. Something inside him shifted. He had spent years following the rules, playing it safe, hoping that reason and restraint would be enough. But they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Because they had no idea who they had just declared war on. Malcolm Hayes sat on the cold pavement, his hands trembling as they pressed against Rex's still warm body. His breath was uneven, his mind caught in a free fall between disbelief and fury. The blood on his hands wasn't his own, but it might as well have been. The dog that had been his partner, his protector, his family, was gone. Just like that. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmured conversations of the officers standing over him. Their voices detached, unconcerned, as if they hadn't just taken a life. "That's what happens when you don't control your dog," Calloway muttered, nudging his boot against the lifeless form beside Malcolm. Malcolm's fingers curled into fists, the weight of his grief pressing against his chest like a steel beam. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to react, to lash out, to break something. Someone. But he had learned long ago that anger, if not wielded with precision, was nothing more than a weapon used against the one who carried it. So, he didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he forced himself to breathe. Slow. Controlled. He felt the world narrow to a pinpoint, his surroundings fading until all that remained was a single, unshakable truth. These men thought they had won. They thought their uniforms would protect them, that their story, the only one that would be believed, would close this chapter before it even began. They had no idea who they had just crossed. Malcolm had spent years in the shadows, operating in places where failure meant death. His time in the Delta Force had stripped him of any illusions about morality and war. He had seen men like Calloway and Miller before, men who wore authority like a shield, who wielded it as a weapon, who believed the power given to them was absolute. But Malcolm knew better. Power was only absolute until the wrong man decided it wasn't. His hands, still stained with Rex's blood, felt eerily steady as he wiped them against his jeans and pushed himself to his feet. The officers tensed, as if suddenly realizing that whatever control they thought they had over this situation had just slipped through their fingers. "Am I under arrest?" Malcolm asked, his voice deceptively calm. Calloway exchanged a glance with Miller before shaking his head. "Nah," he said, smirking, "but we might have to take you in for questioning, just to be safe." Malcolm let out a quiet breath, his gaze locking onto Calloway's like a predator marking its prey. "I'll be seeing you real soon, officer," he said, his voice even, almost too casual. Calloway laughed. "That's supposed to scare me?" Malcolm didn't answer. He simply turned, stepping over Rex's body as if crossing an invisible line. He would grieve later. For now, he had work to do. Malcolm's fingers moved deftly over his keyboard, the glow of multiple screens illuminating the darkened room. Every ounce of restraint, of patience, of discipline he had ever learned was now channeled into something far more dangerous. Precision. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted destruction. The first step was understanding his enemies. He had already memorized Calloway and Miller's badge numbers, but he needed more. Where they lived, who they knew, their routines, their weaknesses. And Malcolm was nothing if not thorough. His fingers clicked against the keys, pulling up records that most civilians wouldn't have access to. Employment files, complaint records, internal memos. Calloway had been disciplined twice before. excessive force, falsifying reports. But he had always slipped through the cracks. Miller had fewer documented incidents, but that didn't mean he was clean. It just meant he was careful. Malcolm dug deeper. Social media accounts, addresses, bank transactions. The deeper he went, the clearer the picture became. These weren't just bad cops. They were predators who had built their careers on the assumption that no one would ever fight back. But they had never met a man like Malcolm Hayes. By the time the sun began to rise, Malcolm had a plan. Not just for Calloway and Miller, but for the entire system that had protected them. He wasn't just going to take them down. He was going to make sure they never got back up. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message from an old contact. One word. Ready? Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes. He reached for his jacket, pulling it on with the same quiet efficiency that had carried him through countless missions overseas. He wasn't stepping onto a battlefield, not in the conventional sense. But the war had already begun, and Malcolm Hayes never lost a war. Malcolm Hayes moved with a quiet, deliberate calm as he crossed the street toward the bar where Calloway had spent the last few nights drinking away his nerves. The air was thick with the distant hum of city life, the occasional honk of a car, the low murmur of voices spilling from the bar's entrance. He wasn't in a hurry. This wasn't the kind of job that required speed. It required patience, precision. It required Calloway to believe he was still in control, right up until the moment he wasn't. Malcolm had been watching him for days. Calloway, like most men who had spent years believing themselves untouchable, had habits, predictable ones. He came here when he wanted to forget, when the weight of his own actions pressed too hard against his chest. Malcolm knew that weight. He knew what it did to a man when he felt his world start to crumble, when the certainty of his place in it started to slip through his fingers like sand. But the difference between men like Malcolm and men like Calloway was simple. Malcolm had spent years being tested, being trained, being sharpened into something lethal. Calloway? Calloway had spent years hiding behind a badge, mistaking fear for respect, mistaking power for strength. Tonight, he was about to learn the difference. Malcolm leaned against the brick wall outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. From where he stood, he could see Calloway through the large window, slumped over the bar, nursing his fifth drink of the night. His shoulders were tight, his face a mask of barely restrained frustration. He was unraveling. Malcolm let the moment stretch, watching, waiting. Calloway wasn't alone. A few other officers were there, laughing, drinking, unaware that their world had already begun to shift under their feet. But that was fine. Malcolm wasn't interested in them. Not yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Calloway tossed some cash onto the counter and pushed himself off the stool, staggering slightly as he made his way toward the back exit. That was another habit. He never left through the front, never wanted to risk being seen stumbling onto the main street. Malcolm pushed off the wall, moving into the shadows of the alley before Calloway even stepped outside. He heard the door creak open, the heavy thud of boots against pavement. Calloway muttered something under his breath, fumbling with his keys as he leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. Malcolm struck fast. Before Calloway could react, Malcolm's arm wrapped around his throat, yanking him back into the alley. His grip was firm, precise, not enough to cut off air completely, but enough to make panic settle in quick. Calloway thrashed, his hands scrambling for something, his weapon, his phone, anything. But Malcolm was faster. He spun him around and slammed him against the wall, his forearm pressing hard against Calloway's throat. "You took something from me," Malcolm said, his voice a low, controlled whisper. Calloway's eyes widened, his mouth opening to speak, but Malcolm pressed harder, cutting him off. "I want you to think real hard before you lie to me, Calloway," Malcolm continued, his tone measured, almost conversational. "You remember my face, don't you?" Calloway's breathing was shallow, his pulse hammering against Malcolm's arm. He nodded, just barely. Malcolm leaned in, his lips barely an inch from Calloway's ear. "Good. That means you know exactly why you're here." Calloway's fingers clawed weakly at Malcolm's arm, but his strength was fading fast. Fear did that to a man. It drained him quicker than any punch could. Malcolm eased up just enough to let him suck in a sharp breath. "You killed my dog," Malcolm said, his voice a razor's edge. "You laughed about it. Thought it was funny. Thought no one would ever come for you." Calloway coughed, his hands still trembling. Look, man, Malcolm didn't let him finish. He drove his knee into Calloway's ribs, cutting off whatever excuse had been forming in his mouth. The breath left him in a choked wheeze, and he crumpled slightly, his knees threatening to buckle. "You think this is about you?" Malcolm asked, tilting his head slightly. "You think you're the first dirty cop who's gotten too comfortable?" He scoffed. "You're not special, Calloway. You're just unlucky." He let go of him, and Calloway slumped against the wall, gasping. He had barely a second to recover before Malcolm grabbed him by the front of his shirt and yanked him back up. "Here's what's going to happen," Malcolm said, his voice low, calm, but dripping with finality. "You're going to wake up every morning wondering if today is the day it all falls apart. You're going to feel eyes on you, even when you're alone. And when the department turns on you, and they will, you're going to know it was because of me." Calloway's breathing was ragged, his body trembling. "You wanted to be a predator?" Malcolm continued, his voice dipping even lower. "Well, now you're prey." Calloway swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was none. Not from this. Not from Malcolm. Malcolm stepped back, his movements controlled, deliberate. "You don't get to walk away from this clean," he said. "Not anymore." Then, just as silently as he had appeared, Malcolm turned and walked away, leaving Calloway slumped against the wall, his face pale, his body shaking. The hunt had begun, and Malcolm Hayes never stopped hunting. Malcolm Hayes sat in the dimly lit apartment, his fingers drumming against the edge of the desk as he stared at the laptop screen. The glow from the monitor cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the unreadable expression in his eyes. On the screen, a paused video feed showed two men standing in his living room, Calloway and Miller. The grainy black and white footage captured everything. The moment they forced their way in, the moment they attacked him, the smugness in their posture, the certainty that no one would hold them accountable. But that certainty had been their mistake. Malcolm exhaled slowly and pressed play. The video resumed, showing the officers ransacking his home, shoving him against the wall, striking him. He had let it happen. He had let them believe they had won. And now, as he watched the recording again, his plan was set in motion. They thought they had buried their crimes, but Malcolm had been waiting, watching, setting the stage for something they couldn't stop. He opened a secured folder filled with evidence, reports of past misconduct, excessive force complaints, body cam footage that had conveniently gone missing, witness statements from those who had suffered under their abuse. For years, Calloway and Miller had operated with impunity, their actions buried beneath bureaucracy and silence. But Malcolm wasn't just any man. He was a tactician, trained to dismantle threats piece by piece. He uploaded the files to a series of anonymous drop sites, each one set to release the information to key sources, investigative journalists, civil rights organizations, legal watchdogs. He composed the emails, each one short, direct, carrying a simple message: the truth always comes out. He hit send. The dominoes were falling. The first ripple was small, a single journalist picking up the leaked footage, analyzing the data, cross-referencing the complaints. But soon, the ripple became a wave. More media outlets picked it up, and within 24 hours, headlines were flashing across news stations and social media platforms. 2 officers accused of brutality faced new allegations. Shocking footage surfaces of officers beating innocent man in his own home. Are these the faces of a corrupt system? Calloway and Miller had spent years making sure they controlled the narrative, making sure that no accusation against them ever stuck. But they had underestimated Malcolm. The moment the footage hit the public, it was over. Inside the police department, chaos erupted. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, not because they wanted justice, but because they had no choice. The department had spent years covering for Calloway and Miller, but now their names were a liability. They weren't officers anymore. They were ticking time bombs. The police chief held a press conference, his face tight with barely restrained frustration. "We take these allegations seriously," he stated, reading from a script designed to create distance. "The department is fully cooperating with the investigation." It was a lie. Behind closed doors, Calloway and Miller were scrambling. They had been protected for so long that they had never considered what it would mean to lose that protection. Miller was the first to crack, pacing his living room, fists clenched, paranoia setting in. "This isn't just bad press," he muttered, his voice thick with panic. "This is a setup. Someone is coming for us." Calloway was quieter, but his jaw was clenched, his grip on his whiskey glass so tight it threatened to shatter. "You think I don't know that?" he growled. "You think I don't know who it is?" Miller's eyes darted to him. "You think it's him?" Calloway exhaled sharply. "I don't think, Miller. I know." But knowing wouldn't save them. Malcolm moved through the streets with a calm precision, his expression unreadable. He had spent years in war zones, tracking enemies, eliminating threats. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield overseas. This was his home. And the men he was hunting weren't foreign adversaries. They were men who had taken an oath to serve and protect, only to twist that power into something vile. He reached the small, nondescript building where a legal advocacy group had been waiting for him. Inside, a woman named Jasmine Carter, a lawyer with a reputation for taking on impossible cases, looked up as he entered. "You really did it," she murmured, pushing a folder across the desk. "This footage, the reports, it's enough to bury them." Malcolm nodded. "Not enough," he said quietly. "Not yet." Jasmine studied him for a moment. "What's next?" Malcolm's gaze was steady. "We push harder. The media storm is only the beginning. I want an indictment. I want them charged, and I want them in cuffs before they can run." Jasmine exhaled, shaking her head with something between admiration and disbelief. "You're relentless, you know that?" Malcolm allowed himself the faintest smirk. "That's why we're here." She nodded and stood. "Then let's finish this." The next morning, Calloway and Miller arrived at the precinct, expecting damage control. Instead, they were met with a wall of reporters, their faces splashed across every screen. The moment they stepped inside, Internal Affairs was waiting. "Officers Calloway and Miller," the lead investigator said, his expression unreadable. "You are both suspended, effective immediately, pending further investigation." Miller opened his mouth to protest, but Calloway grabbed his arm. "Don't," he muttered, his face pale. He understood. They weren't being investigated. They were being thrown to the wolves. And Malcolm Hayes was watching, waiting, ready for the final move. The air inside the precinct was thick with unease. Officers moved with rigid postures, avoiding eye contact as the tension spread through the department like wildfire. The walls that had protected Calloway and Miller for years were collapsing, and they knew it. Their once loyal allies were now watching from the sidelines, unwilling to be dragged down with them. The news had broken, and with it, the carefully constructed facade of control they had maintained for years. The leaks, the footage, the testimony. Malcolm Hayes had set the pieces in motion, and now all that remained was the fall. Calloway sat in a windowless conference room, his jaw clenched, his fingers digging into the edge of the table. Across from him, his lawyer, a department-appointed defense attorney who barely concealed his frustration, flipped through the latest reports, shaking his head. "They're making an example out of you," the lawyer muttered, pushing a file across the table. "Internal Affairs isn't just investigating you. They're building a case." Calloway snatched the folder, flipping it open with a sneer. The pages detailed complaints spanning years, cases he had long since buried, incidents that had been swept under the rug, witness statements, photos, the body cam footage that was supposed to be gone. The weight of it settled over him like a vice tightening around his throat. "This is bull!" he snapped. "They've never come after us before. Why now?" His lawyer exhaled slowly, closing the folder. "Because you're not just a problem anymore. You're a liability. The department doesn't care about justice, Calloway. They care about survival. And right now, you and Miller are the easiest sacrifices they can make." The realization hit like a gut punch. For years he had been untouchable, protected by the same system that was now turning against him. He had been careful, but not careful enough. He had relied on fear to keep people in line, but fear was fleeting. And now, for the first time in his career, he was on the receiving end of it. Miller paced the hallway outside, his movements erratic. His hands twitched at his sides, his face pale and drawn. He had always relied on Calloway to lead, to dictate their next move. But now, there were no moves left to make. When Calloway stepped out of the conference room, Miller was waiting, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "They're going to arrest us," Miller said, his voice tight with desperation. "You know that, right?" Calloway's jaw flexed, his teeth grinding together. "Not if we move first." Miller blinked, the meaning behind those words settling in. "You're talking about running." Calloway exhaled sharply, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Think about it, Miller. If we stay, we go down. They'll slap us with every charge they can find, make sure we never see daylight again. But if we leave now—" "Where?" Miller cut in, his voice rising. "Where the hell do we go? You think we can just disappear? You think nobody's watching us?" Calloway knew Miller was right. They weren't just any cops facing charges. They were the story. Their faces were on every news channel, their names being dragged through every headline. The public wanted justice. The department wanted closure. And Malcolm Hayes, he wanted them buried. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the first real sliver of panic creeping in. "Then we find another way." Miller scoffed, his breath shaky. "What other way?" Before Calloway could answer, the hallway filled with movement. Officers passed by, their conversations hushed. A heavy silence settled over them as they caught sight of the precinct's captain, flanked by two agents in dark suits. Federal agents. Miller stiffened. "Jesus," he whispered. Calloway's heart pounded. This wasn't just internal. This wasn't just a suspension or an investigation meant to smooth things over. This was the beginning of the end. The captain's voice rang out. "Calloway, Miller, step into my office." They exchanged a look. There was no escape now. The walk to the captain's office felt like a death march. Calloway kept his head high, his jaw set, but inside, his mind was racing. Miller looked ready to be sick, his fingers twitching like he wanted to reach for his gun, but even he knew that would be suicide. The moment the door shut behind them, one of the agents stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He held up a thick file, tapping it against his palm. "We have enough evidence to bring formal charges against both of you," the agent stated, his voice clipped. "Excessive force, illegal searches, falsified reports, and obstruction of justice." Calloway didn't blink. "You think this is going to stick?" The agent's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It already has." Miller let out a sharp breath, panic written all over his face. "We're still cops," he blurted out. "We have rights." The captain's gaze was cold. Not anymore. Calloway felt the shift in the air, the moment when power was no longer in his hands. He had spent years ruling through intimidation, through the certainty that no matter what he did, the system would always protect him. But Malcolm Hayes had ripped that certainty away, exposed him for what he was, and left him with nowhere to run. One of the agents pulled out a pair of cuffs. "Gregory Calloway, Anthony Miller, you are under arrest." The metal snapped around Calloway's wrists, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. Miller's voice cracked. "This can't be happening." Calloway said nothing. He kept his head high, but as the agents led them through the precinct, the whispers followed, the murmurs of officers who had once feared them now watching them fall. Malcolm Hayes had done what no one else had dared to do. He had torn them down, not with fists, not with threats, but with truth. and truth, once unleashed, could never be caged again. As Calloway stepped out into the blinding flashes of cameras and the roar of reporters demanding answers, he finally understood. He was already a dead man walking. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that carried weight, that pressed down on the air, suffocating everything in its grasp. Every person in the room, from the jurors shifting in their seats to the journalists scribbling furiously in their notepads, felt the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. At the center of it all, Malcolm Hayes sat at the witness stand, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly against the polished wood. He had been in countless high-pressure situations before, in places where the wrong move meant death, where decisions had to be made in the span of a heartbeat. But this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't an enemy hiding in the shadows. This was justice, laid bare in front of the world. Across the room, Calloway and Miller sat at the defense table. They no longer carried the arrogance they once had. The uniforms were gone, stripped away like the power they had wielded so carelessly for years. Their suits didn't fit quite right, their postures stiff, like men who were clinging to the last remnants of control. But there was no control left to hold on to. The system they had once bent to their will had turned on them, and now they were drowning. The prosecutor stood, her heels clicking against the tile as she approached the stand. She was composed, deliberate, the kind of woman who never wasted a word. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying through the room with quiet authority. "Can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. He had played it over in his mind 1,000 times, every detail burned into his memory, every second branded into the marrow of his bones. "I was walking my dog," he began, his voice steady. His name was Rex. He was a German shepherd, 6 years old, trained, disciplined, loyal. A pause. "He was my family." He didn't look at Calloway and Miller, didn't need to. He could feel their presence, their discomfort, their growing realization that this wasn't going to go the way they had hoped. "We were passing through the neighborhood, like we had done 100 times before, and then I saw the headlights." The jury was watching him closely now, leaning in, listening to every syllable. They pulled up beside me, 2 officers, Calloway and Miller. For the first time, he turned his gaze toward them. Calloway kept his eyes down, his jaw tight. Miller swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "They asked me where I was going," Malcolm continued. "Asked me for ID. I told them I lived in the neighborhood, showed them my license. They saw the address. They knew I was telling the truth." The prosecutor nodded. "And what happened next?" "They didn't care," Malcolm said, his voice sharper now. "They wanted something else, a reaction, an excuse." The tension in the room thickened. They started pushing, their tone changed. The questions became accusations. Calloway kept his hand on his gun the whole time. A long pause. And then Rex stepped forward. The courtroom was utterly still. "He wasn't attacking," Malcolm said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't aggressive. He was trained to protect, to stand between me and danger. And when Miller reached for me, Rex did exactly what he was supposed to do." His fingers curled slightly against the wood of the witness stand. "He stepped between us." Malcolm inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay steady. "Miller drew his weapon," he said, "and before I could even tell him to stop, he pulled the trigger." A single breath from the jury, a collective shift in the gallery. "Rex didn't even make a sound," Malcolm continued. "He just collapsed." The prosecutor let the silence stretch, let the weight of the words settle into every corner of the room. Then, finally, she spoke. "And what did you do next, Mr. Hayes?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I did what any man would do. I stepped toward my dog." His voice darkened, the raw edge of grief cutting through every word. "I didn't lunge. I didn't resist. I just took a step. And that was all the excuse they needed." The jurors were no longer just listening. They were feeling every moment of it, seeing it through his eyes. They tackled me to the ground, Malcolm said. They beat me. They tased me. They put cuffs on my wrists while I was still lying beside my dog's body. His voice didn't shake, but the room did. They dragged me away while he was still warm. Another pause. A slow exhale. And they laughed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge raised a hand for silence. The prosecutor stepped closer. And after they arrested you, what happened? Malcolm met her gaze. They let me go. A few jurors frowned, confused. They never charged me, never booked me, because they had nothing. The prosecutor nodded. And why do you believe that is? Because this was never about the law, Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. It was about control, about power. They wanted to remind me that I didn't belong. His gaze flicked back to Calloway and Miller, both of whom were now visibly sweating. But they were wrong. A heavy pause. Because I fought back. The prosecutor gave a slight nod, stepping back toward the jury. No further questions. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple. Court will resume tomorrow for closing arguments. But everyone already knew how this was going to end. As Malcolm walked out of the courtroom, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The world had already seen the truth. And now, justice was coming. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that weighed down on every person in the room. The jury sat motionless, their eyes trained on the man at the witness stand. The prosecutors had done their part. The defense had tried, and failed, to spin a narrative that would save Calloway and Miller from the justice that had long been overdue. And now, the judge sat poised, ready to deliver the final sentence. Malcolm Hayes sat still, his hands folded in his lap. He had faced men with guns, men who had nothing to lose, men who would rather die than surrender. He had seen war in places where law meant nothing, where the only justice was the kind that came at the end of a barrel. But this was different. This was not war. This was the moment where everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, finally reached its reckoning. Calloway and Miller sat at the defense table, no longer officers, no longer the untouchable enforcers of their own corrupt version of the law. Their expensive suits couldn't hide the truth. The sweat on their brows, the way their fingers twitched, the way Miller's jaw clenched so tightly he looked like he might snap. None of it mattered anymore. The badge that had shielded them, the system that had protected them, had finally abandoned them. The judge cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. His voice was steady, authoritative, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. He wasn't just delivering a sentence, he was making history. Mr. Calloway, Mr. Miller, the judge began, his gaze leveling at the two men. You both stand before this court today not as officers of the law, but as criminals. You were given power, entrusted with the safety of this community, and instead, you abused that power in the most egregious way. Calloway's fingers curled into fists. Miller's gaze flickered to Malcolm for the briefest of moments, but Malcolm didn't react. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Rex, for every person who had suffered under their rule, for every innocent life they had trampled without fear of consequence. You shot an innocent dog, the judge continued, his tone darkening. Not because it was a threat, but because you could. You brutalized a man who had done nothing wrong, and even after all that, you thought you would walk away unscathed. He sighed, shaking his head slightly before continuing. The law is meant to protect. It is meant to uphold justice, and in this case, justice demands that you face the full weight of your actions. The courtroom was silent. Even the journalists, who had spent weeks covering the trial, barely moved. Every word spoken felt final, like the last nails in the coffins of two men who had spent years believing they would never face judgment. I hereby sentence Gregory Calloway and Anthony Miller to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The moment stretched into eternity. A sharp inhale from Calloway. A quiet, strangled exhale from Miller. The gavel hit the bench. It was over. A slow murmur rippled through the gallery. Some gasped, some nodded. Others simply sat there, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Justice, real, undeniable justice, had been served. Malcolm exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat there, letting the weight of it settle in. Calloway turned slightly, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," he muttered, just low enough that only Malcolm could hear. Malcolm finally looked at him. For the first time since the trial had started, he let the full force of his gaze meet Calloway's. His expression didn't change. His voice remained steady. "Yes, it is." Miller opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at Malcolm like a man drowning, reaching for something, anything, that could save him. But there was nothing left to grab onto. The bailiffs moved forward. The sound of chains locking into place filled the room as they cuffed Calloway and Miller, escorting them out of the courtroom. The same way they had once dragged Malcolm off the streets, treating him like nothing more than another black man they could dispose of. But this time, they were the ones being led away, and there was no one coming to save them. Malcolm stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. The cameras were waiting just outside, reporters hungry for a statement. He could already hear the chaos beyond the doors, the chants, the questions, the celebrations. For those who have followed this story, let it not be just another tale. Let it be a reminder, a call to action, a spark that ignites something deeper. The world is full of injustice, but change does not come from waiting. It comes from acting, from standing up, from speaking out, from refusing to accept corruption as inevitable. The victory in this story was hard-earned, but it is not the end. It is proof that battles can be won, that voices can make a difference, that justice is not a myth but a reality waiting to be claimed. At Civil Rights Fight, we are committed to telling the stories that matter, to shining a light on injustice, to ensuring that the voices of the unheard are amplified. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the fight for accountability, if you believe in a world where justice is not reserved for the privileged, then don't just read. Act. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and join a movement that refuses to be silent. Together, we are stronger. Together, we can ensure that no more lives are shattered by unchecked power. Together, we can create a world where justice is not just an idea, it is a reality. The fight is far from over. But with every person who stands up, with every voice that joins the cause, the balance shifts. The system begins to crack. And those who have spent their lives believing they could act without consequences begin to realize they were wrong. Subscribe now and be part of something greater, because change does not wait, and neither should we.